Welcome, everyone. I hope you had a great weekend. It's good to see everyone again. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel discussion today. How will the war in Ukraine end? A Western perspective. In an essay in the New York Times in late May, President Biden laid out the US administration's approach, interests and goals in relation to the war in Ukraine, referencing, and I quote, a democratic, independent, sovereign and prosperous Ukraine with the means to deter and defend itself against further aggression as a goalpost. Biden emphasized in that essay that he will not pressure Ukraine in private or in public to make any territorial concessions as part of any peace process with Russia. Rather, he said, US military aid is meant to help Ukrainians defend themselves well enough to be in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table. And Biden also laid out the broader implications of action versus inaction vis-a-vis Russia in Ukraine, arguing if Russia does not pay a heavy price for its actions, it could mark the end of the rules-based international order and open the door to aggression elsewhere. Now, if we turn from the Biden administration to the abundance of op-eds, analysis, essays that Western academics, policy analysts, and public intellectuals have written on desirable paths forward in Ukraine, I think a wide spectrum of views emerges before us. You have on one end, for example, Henry Kissinger's remarks in Davos in late May, to the extent that Ukraine should make territorial concessions to reach a peace deal with Russia, or Barry Posen's essay, I think about 10 days ago in Foreign Affairs, which was called Ukraine's Implausible Theories of Victory, subtitle, The Fantasy of Russian Defeat and the Case for Diplomacy. And on the other hand of the spectrum, for instance, Anne Applebaum arguing in The Atlantic in late May that the war won't end until Putin loses, offering the Russian president a face-saving compromise will only enable further aggression. And then, of course, there's not just a divergence in views on what is considered desirable, morally imperative, or strategically necessary from a Western viewpoint, but there's also simply a divergence of what is actually considered realistic in terms of the trajectory on the battlefield. Ben Hodges, for instance, the former commanding general of the US Army in Europe, assessed in an interview, I think about 2 weeks ago, that Russia has overextended its military in Ukraine and that the invasion could come to an end in 2023, next year, if the Western powers continue to support Ukraine militarily. Of course, others are less optimistic here. We have an excellent panel today with us to consider the question, how will the war in Ukraine end? What can the West do to impact the trajectory in Ukraine? Are there perhaps differences on these questions within the West, for instance, between the United States and the Europeans? And also, what are the implications of different endgames in Ukraine for broader issues, European security, arms control, and strategic stability? I will now introduce our distinguished speakers. As a first speaker, we have Rose Gottemoeller, who's the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. She served as Deputy Secretary General at NATO from 2016 until 2019. And for the 5 years prior to that, she was Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the US State Department. She was also the chief US negotiator for the New START Treaty, which was signed in 2010, and she was the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center from 2006 until 2008. Welcome, Rose. Next, we will have Dr. Sam Charap, who is senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, where his research focuses on the political economy and foreign policies of Russia and former Soviet states, European and Eurasian regional security, US deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control. Before joining RAND, Sam Charap was a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at IISS from 2012 until 2017. And his book, co-authored with Timothy Colton, Everyone Loses, the Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia, was published in 2017. Our third speaker will be Dr. David Holloway, who's the Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History Emeritus, also at Stanford University. He was the co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford and the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. He has written extensively on the history of nuclear weapons with a focus on the Soviet Union, for instance, Stalin and the Bomb, the Soviet Union and Atomic Energy, 1939 to 1956. And our last speaker, last but not least, today will be Dr. Siegfried Hecker, who is Professor Research Emeritus in the Department of Management, Science and Engineering, and a Senior Fellow Emeritus also of the Freeman Spogli Institute. He's Director Emeritus at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, where he served as the director from 1986 until 1997 and a Senior Fellow until 2005. And over the past 3 decades, Dr. Hecker has fostered cooperation with the Russian and Chinese nuclear laboratories to enhance the safety and security of their nuclear assets. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. This panel will be recorded. We have 90 minutes in total. We will have some opening remarks from the 4 speakers, followed by a moderated discussion, and then we will open it up for Q&A by the fellows. And with that, I would like to invite Rose Gottemoeller to offer her opening remarks.
Thank you so very much, Hanna, and thank you for the invitation, Anna Vasilyeva, to participate on this distinguished panel. It's a wonderful group, and I'm looking forward to our discussion as well as with those participating at Monterey in the Summer Symposium. You mentioned a number of the eminent people who have been publishing lately. I did want to make 2 quick remarks. One notable, I thought, was that Henry Kissinger on the PBS NewsHour a few weeks after did kind of recant his remarks there about Ukraine just having to get over its territorial losses. So I think he was taking some criticism for that point of view. But the other thing I wanted to note is that there's been some interesting back and forth just in the last day from Leonid Volkov. This Twitter stream that I put in the chat is interesting because he brings up a point that I think many are concerned about. That is that Putin will certainly use any pause, any ceasefire, just to regroup, to spend the next couple of years rebuilding and preparing the next phase of the war. That has been an important theme that has run through, I think, a couple of commentaries. And so it is Russia as the resurgent imperial power continuing to destabilize around its periphery as long as it does not get what it wants. And surely that is a major concern for the NATO allies, and including the new NATO aspiring states, Finland and Sweden, who have felt that there simply could not be stable security in Europe going forward with Russia behaving as it is today and trying to reestablish its imperial presence, not according to the rule of law by our lights, but according to its own sense of the geopolitics and authoritarian system. But I did want to mention, Hanna, of all the questions that you asked in preparation for this session today, I thought the most difficult was, what do we expect in 5 years, in 10 years, in 30 years? And here I would like to get at a question on many people's minds. In 30 years, surely, nowadays we say, well, we cannot predict when Putin is going to be shoved out of office, die, or leave, one way or the other. And 5 years, we certainly cannot say that Putin will not be present. 10 years, we cannot say Putin will not be present. But in 30 years, we can certainly say that Putin will not be present. Well, he will be 100 years old at that point. So, or over 100 years old. So I have my doubts that he can last that long, even if they pump him full of wax. I did want to talk for a minute about what we would expect to see in Russia in 30 years. And therefore, this is a discussion of the post-Putin era. And is there any chance, and I'd be interested in discussion among this group, of the reformist elements in Russia being resurgent at that point, whenever Putin goes, and able to step forward into the political game. Putin has done his best, of course, to put in place this very serious, very strong, and historically very, I would say, stable security architecture involving the secret police, the security police, the Oman, the KGB. They've gone through many names across history, including back into Tsarist era. So one of the questions is this a permanent feature of the Russian state that we cannot imagine it being superseded by a more reformist-minded rule of law kind of regime? And I do think that that's a question for how long are we going to have to deal with Russia as essentially an aggressor and a negative force in Europe? And is 30 years a possible horizon for a more optimistic future? But I would be interested in people's comments on that. I certainly don't foresee it in the next 5 or even 10 years. Now, final point I would like to make and also bring up for discussion is, what do we do now about issues that are an existential threat to us all? Do we keep the lines of communication open with Russia? And I count there two in particular. The first is, of course, continuing work on nuclear arms control and nuclear disarmament. Can we foresee, despite our dreadful relationship with the Russian Federation and the egregious behavior of the Russian leadership and Putin himself, can we foresee continuing? And we have always, despite very severe downturns in the US-USSR relationship historically, particularly in the 80s, early 80s, we were able to keep some lines of communication open and continue to work to press forward on nuclear disarmament. So that's one area where there's an existential threat. The other is climate change and the rapid changes in the Arctic. The Russian Federation, of course, spans an enormous breadth of the Arctic, and having them not at all present and participating in efforts to address climate change in the Arctic and polar regions, I think is also contributing to an existential threat to humanity. So I will be interested in our discussion how people look at that. I've been really, myself feeling my way, because at the moment, many argue that any diplomacy with Russia is essentially falling into their game, falling into their hands, so to say, and undermining our own position. Or are there areas of existential threat that we need to continue to work with them? So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Hannah, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for these opening remarks. Sam, Charap, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Hannah, and thanks to Anna for the invitation, and to all of you for being here today. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this question about how the war might end. How will it end? Rather than give you a prediction, though, I'm going to speak what I think about are three of the sort of categories of most plausible outcomes at this point, and then maybe briefly discuss some of the less plausible outcomes. And so if we're to look at the ways in which the war might end, starting with perhaps the best case outcome would be some form of political settlement that not only ends the fighting, but also resolves some of the underlying political issues, be they territorial control, the sort of regional security, geopolitical issues that Russia has raised at various points, Ukraine's geopolitical status, et cetera, and there are significant advantages to a political settlement as a general matter, and that not only do that entail the end of actual bloodshed, but it also offers the possibility of a sustainable security environment, stable security environment that could enable both political it is consistent with a number of positive outcomes for everyone across the board, be it political pluralism in both Russia and Ukraine, economic viability of the Ukrainian state, Russia's status in the world, the potential for the resolution of some of the economic consequences of the war. So generally speaking, I think we can think of a political settlement, regardless, not speaking about the specifics, for a moment as the sort of best case outcome. Now, neither side would by definition be completely happy with the terms of that settlement. But we can just think about it as a category of outcomes that's defined by a sort of resolution of some of the underlying political issues that leads to a sustainable peace over time. A second category of outcomes I would put under the banner of sustainable ceasefire / armistice. And we can look to historical examples like Korea here for context, where the armistice, which was negotiated almost exclusively among uniformed military and dealt almost exclusively with the mechanics, the sort of mechanisms of the end to the fighting and the line of territorial control, led to a relatively stable peace, but without any resolution of the underlying political issues. So that's how I would, differentiate between these first two baskets. Clearly, that would remain. There would remain a number of associated challenges that you wouldn't have with a political settlement, such as, the contestation of some of those underlying political issues, the potential for, continuing economic consequences, and so on. But clearly, with sort of an end to the bloodshed comes obviously a lot of benefits, particularly to Ukraine and to an end to the death and destruction there. A third category of outcomes would be something, I don't have a one-word phrase for these things, but something like an unsustained ceasefire, persistent low-level conflict. Rose referenced the possibility of a ceasefire just being an operational pause that is of renewed fighting after a short period of diminishment of fighting. I mean, you could sort of put Minsk in this category as an agreement that really didn't either end fighting or resolve political issues. And so I think those are the three plausible categories of ways in which this could end. I think as the days go by, the viability of a political settlement becomes more and more tenuous. I would say that's probably the lowest probability of those three sets of outcomes right now, unfortunately. I think we would be lucky to have a sustainable ceasefire or an armistice at this point. And frankly, that leaves us with this very unsatisfactory set of outcomes that would involve some degree of persistent conflict over time. And I think it's important to think about whether it's worth using policy instruments to alter trajectories either in one or the other direction here, because if you agree with my analysis that we're likely headed towards a sort of persistent conflict of some sort, there are significant consequences for all involved from that kind of an outcome. I do think for the question, in terms of thinking about war outcomes, end states, we should, for the moment, as much as we might want to embrace them or find them repulsive, sort of put to the side lower probability ones that at this point, I don't see any empirical evidence to document their viability, and that is a complete victory of either side, the complete collapse of either side. And so, the sort of the relatively sort of extremes of the way this might end that perhaps were on the table at some point early in terms of analytical discussions early in the conflict, at this point seem just not to be in the cards. So if we exclude those, we end up with these three categories, and then the question is which of those is more beneficial, I guess, for the parties involved. At the moment, the question really does settle around lines of territorial control, and both parties being dissatisfied with the status quo and wanting to change it in various directions. Russia wants to take more territory, Ukraine desiring to, via counteroffensives, retake some of the land that Russia has occupied since February 24th. And I can't see that. I mean, I think that process is likely to play itself out over the coming months. And at the, if there's a sort of exhaustion factor that might set in, you might end up with a move towards one of these three baskets of end states, let's put it that way.
Thank you very much, Sam. Professor Holloway.
Right. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Anna, for the invitation to take part in this discussion. I wanted to address briefly 3 points. So the first one is, how will the war in Ukraine end? And I had as my first sub-question, by what process? And I agree with Sam that a negotiated settlement would be the best, if perhaps at the moment it looks the least likely. It would certainly be preferable to a frozen conflict or to a kind of low-level conflict going on. But I think when I come to my prediction, I think negotiated settlement is very unlikely at the moment. With what outcome? What we're seeing, and of course the war can change, so it's very difficult to make firm statements on the basis of the current situation, but what we're seeing is a war of attrition over the Donbass. And I think if the Russian forces do succeed in finally controlling Donetsk region, then that they will be difficult to dislodge without significant outside help. Then there's the issue of, well, what about regaining control of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions? That also will be difficult, maybe more manageable, maybe that's where fighting will focus. And another thing that is striking about the current situation is that Russian aims are really quite unclear. I mean, the justification that Putin gave was to liberate the Donbass, but then launched an attack on Kiev. Then we have senior generals saying, well, our goal is really to take Novorossiya and link up with the Russian troops in Transnistria. And in a recent lecture by Zoom at Stanford, Ukrainian historian Yaroslav Hrytsak talked about a 2008 Russian plan to divide Ukraine into 3 parts, with Western Ukraine, as it were, to go free, the South and the East in Russian hands, and a rump state around Kiev, subordinate to Russia the way that Belarus is. So if one wants to find any good element in that, it is that it gives Putin flexibility to declare victory, as it were, at different points. But it also creates this huge uncertainty relating to a point that Rose raised about, well, an agreement on part of it, or an operational pause or a ceasefire is only preparation for the next round of the conflict. And I think that even if the Donbass is established as if the 2 provinces are established as separate states, or the Donbass is incorporated into Russia, the war can continue for some time. I chose near-term predictions rather than Rose's long-term prediction, although I think that's an exceedingly important issue. But I think in the next 6 to 12 months from now, the war will still be going on, because each side will be probing the other over the winter. And by each side, I mean Russia on the one, but Ukraine and the states supporting it on the other. So how will German support, how will West European support withstand the energy crisis over the winter? Will Western supplies of arms be enough to help Ukraine hold Russian advances? And I think also there are constraints on the Russian side to be assessed. Kremlin, seems to me, does fear opposition at home, very tough security actions and policies over the last months, in particular, the very tough suppression of protests, the reluctance to launch a general mobilization. I think each side will want to see how the war goes in the winter and perhaps reassess the situation then. And I think there's quite a lot at stake in the coming winter, well, in the coming 12 months, I would say. So the second question, Hannah, you raised was how to assess this trajectory. I think it's bad for Ukraine. It will continue to be battered by a war. It's bad for, potentially bad, well, it's bad for European security, although a lot of the question there is how will Europe, how will the West react? It's bad for strategic stability and arms control, because I think even if talks on strategic stability do resume during the war, the timing, in a sense, is knocked out, because follow on to the New START treaty, ideally people were thinking wanted something in place by 2024. That looks difficult, and bad for the non-proliferation treaty, because Russian policy, I think, increases the incentives for some states to acquire nuclear weapons. For Russia's global relations, obviously deepening bad relations with the West, inevitably focusing more on China, on Asia. I think, unfortunately, that's not an undesirable outcome for elements in the Russian leadership who see themselves as strengthening Russia and its position in a new Asia-dominated world order. And finally, briefly on nuclear escalation, because I know Sig will talk about that. The nuclear factor, of course, is already playing a role. US and NATO have adopted several important limitations: no boots on the ground in in Ukraine, no no-fly zone, no fighter aircraft, restrictions on missile range. And of course, other considerations have no doubt entered into these decisions, but the nuclear factor is certainly there. And in President Biden's New York Times article, which Hannah mentioned, he does say, this is to be a limited war. Any use of nuclear weapons would be completely unacceptable. So I think it's important to think of scenarios and how to respond, to watch very carefully for any steps taken to make nuclear weapons ready to use. And on the issue of a demonstration shot, I changed my mind. I used to think, what's the point? We know they have nuclear weapons. Why would you try to have a demonstration shot? I mean, a kind of non-target shot. And when I heard that Putin had said to Trump at one point, the Europeans are frightened of nuclear weapons. Think of the early 1980s. Then there a demonstration shot could be, as it were, a step up from the rhetoric that we've been having. And I think that's a possibility in terms of having some kind of impact on opinion in Western Europe. Right, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Professor Hecker, please.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Anna. And happy to be here with the Summer Symposium. I've done it numerous times in person, and what I always enjoyed was actually meeting the fellows. And so hello to the fellows, unfortunately only electronically, and hopefully sometime we'll get a chance to meet. So I have the benefit of following my three good colleagues, and they've already said many things much better than I could say. And so I'll focus mostly on the nuclear issue because that's indeed my background. But before doing so, let me sort of give you a personal sense that, in my opinion, no matter how the war ends or drags on, there are no winners. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Militarily, even if the Russians, keep the upper hand, the Russians have already suffered significantly on the international scene, and they will continue to suffer. Certainly, their relation with the West has been, totally severed for now. Their relationship, let's say, with China and others, as David just mentioned, I think they will just become more subservient to China, which is not necessarily going to be in the Russians' interest. And the global South, for the most part, so far has sort of turned a blind eye, but they can't also be impressed by what Russia has done. So I don't see Russia really benefiting, even if they say so-called win. For Ukraine, regardless of what happens, it's already been a disaster that sort of takes one back to what happened in the Second World War, sort of the complete destruction of various countries. And to me, it turns out that's particularly instructive because I was born in late 1943, 20 kilometers from the Ukrainian border in a little town called Tomaszów-Lubelski in Poland of Austrian parents. My father was stationed in the German military. My tenure in Poland didn't last long because the Germans were chased out of there. But then I grew up in post-World War II Europe, in Austria particularly. And so I witnessed firsthand just what the destruction of the infrastructures of those countries did, what the destruction and sort of the disconnects that it put into the families. On my mother's side, the families were just completely uprooted. My father never returned from the war. And so what I can see is the Ukrainian people, already so many have lost their lives. Their country has been destroyed. And so they're going to face what we faced at the end of World War II and perhaps worse. And so Ukraine also cannot be a real winner. But the real question I wanted to address, Anna, was the one that you posed sort of as a side question. What else, could the Ukrainian invasion do in terms of affecting the rest of the West's agendas, such as climate change, etc.? So what I want to address is the global nuclear order. And that's actually what's really, aside from these personal calamities, of what's happening in the war, is to me, having spent most of my professional life in the nuclear arena and having watched as sort of what I call a global nuclear order has evolved and been developed since the Second World War. As I look at that order, and to me, it's particularly crucial that we would be able to maintain that global nuclear order. The way that I see it, Putin's invasion of Ukraine blew up that order. And I just don't know how we're going to build it back. So let me a few things about what I think that global nuclear order is. So there's sort of four main norms that have developed. And just to briefly state them, one is the norm of no use. And so in other words, that was deeply ingrained in the Reagan-Gorbachev dictum, a nuclear war cannot be won and a nuclear war should not be fought. Well, Putin has just really put that in jeopardy with his nuclear saber rattling, even though he signed the document this January, which underscored the importance of that norm. With the invasion, he has really put that norm at risk. And so, of course, lots of people asking the question, would Putin use nuclear weapons? We don't know. I hope not. But already his saber rattling has endangered that norm. The second norm is the norm of non-proliferation. So in other words, the way I like to put it, the fewer fingers on the nuclear trigger, the better. And so many countries, and particularly the United States and Russia, have worked together to create that norm of non-proliferation. The non-proliferation treaty is sort of the centerpiece of that. But non-proliferation regime is a much, much broader fabric of agreements and treaties and practices and organizations. It's enormously intricate. It involves organizations like the IAEA, and it involves things like security assurances so that countries do not develop their own nuclear weapons. So if we now look at, as I look at that fabric, Putin is tearing apart the essence of that fabric. And one of the clearest demonstrations of that is by invading, first of all, already in 2014, Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, and now Ukraine. He's trashed the Budapest Memorandum. The 1994 were, some of the nuclear powers, particularly Russia, United States, Britain, had promised sovereignty to Ukraine, not to be threatened by nuclear weapons, not to have their sovereignty threatened at all, if they gave up the former Soviet nuclear weapons. And clearly, Putin has trashed that. So he's taken one of those pieces, a security guarantee. And so all of those things that constitute nuclear nonproliferation, in my opinion, Putin has already put at risk. And almost no matter how this war ends, it's going to be difficult to put it back together. The third norm I would put is sort of that all countries agree to work together on the safety and security of nuclear assets, everything from nuclear fissile materials, the bomb grade stuff, to radiological materials, to nuclear installations of various sorts. The safety and security, we've recognized that those are really important. And even countries like Pakistan and India, for example, as much as they have been at odds since the creation of those two countries in 1947, in 1998, they agreed not to attack each other's nuclear facilities and power plants. Well, when Putin's folks went into Chernobyl, what was done there is clearly a violation of all of that. And then in Zaporizhzhia, where the nuclear power reactors have to work at gunpoint, and the continued occupation of that undermines this whole norm that we were going to work together on issues of nuclear safety, nuclear security. I don't know how one puts that back together. And part of that norm is that the reason that you work together is because you want to protect yourself against the potential of nuclear terrorism. Well, we did. We worked together. The Russians worked with us. The Chinese worked with us also in this thing. And now what we have with Chernobyl, with Zaporizhzhia, is state-sponsored nuclear terrorism. How does one deal when you have a state that actually puts at risk those nuclear facilities? I'll wind it up here pretty quickly, but the fourth norm was that we would all work together for the benefits of nuclear power and nuclear medicine for the world. So in other words, many of the things that the IAEA does, and so nuclear power for nuclear electricity, also for medical isotopes. Well, it turns out Russia has been a very responsible power that's helped to develop that norm. And in fact, they've been more sort of aggressive on that in a positive way, in my opinion, than the United States has. They've done that over the years. Well, now from what they've done, how could they possibly? And certainly the West and a good part of the world has to be concerned as to, do you really want to use Russia as a nuclear supplier for nuclear power plants when it's done the things that it's done, has already done? So my bottom line is that global nuclear order was crucial, for the benefits and to avoid the detriments of nuclear power for these last 75 years. Russia has blown it up. What I'm thinking about, how do we rebuild it regardless of how this war ends? And quite frankly, I just don't know at this point. So let me stop at that point and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all panelists for these great introductory remarks. I do have a question for each of you, if I may. I also suggest that when you answer the question, if you want to sort of comment or respond to anything you've heard from other panelists, that you do that. So I'll pose those questions and then we will go to the fellows for questions as well. So you can start thinking about what you wish to ask the panelists. Rose, I want to start with you. You posed an interesting question asking, well, 30 years from now, if we take the long view, Putin will unlikely be around. What will or will not be permanent features of the Russian system at that time? Could reformist elements come back? And basically, what will that Russia be in 30 years from now that we can deal with? I want to ask you, do you think there is a risk, given the sanctions, given the isolation that Russia finds itself under, the alienation from the West, that 30 years from now, we will essentially be in a world in which Russia has looked east and south to such an extent that it will have become so alienated from the West? And I'm not just talking now at the level of policy making, but at a deeper societal and cultural level, that we basically have sort of nothing to grasp onto, that Russia basically will be gone for good from the West? Or do you think there is sufficiently something there that unites us and that binds Russia to European culture, to the West, that will always be there and that we can sort of latch onto once the situation changes? I mean, sort of what came to mind when I was listening to you was Sasha Gabuyev, I think, recently using the term of Russia turning into a huge Iran of Eurasia over the coming period, and really sort of this disconnect from the West growing quite deep. So that's a question for you. Sam, on your sort of 3 categories of most viable or likely outcomes, the third one of an unsustained ceasefire, a protracted sort of low-level conflict, perhaps being the most likely over the upcoming period. I wanted to sort of jump onto something that David Holloway said, which is evoking this crisis in global energy and food markets that's now emerging. We here in Germany are much worried and debating about whether Gazprom will keep delivering gas through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, you know, how the situation will be in the winter. Do you find it a viable scenario that the combination of low-level protracted conflict on the one hand and the growing impact on Western economies of the combination of the food and energy crisis will produce a situation where support for Ukraine is actually fraying in Western societies, and where that fraying support will actually enable what you termed a rather unlikely outcome, which is that this situation could turn into a Russian victory? How do you see these factors playing together? For David Holloway, David, you mentioned that one of the sort of global implications of what we're seeing in the context of the Ukraine war is Russia trying to foster relations with the global South. Professor Hecker sort of suggested that parts of the global South cannot be too impressed with Russia either, and the situation that Russia is provoking. But it does appear that Russia is reasonably successful right now in fostering those relations, selling hydrocarbons. Putin is going to Tehran this week, certainly across the Middle East, which is a region that I look at. The Russians continue to be very active diplomatically, also parts of Latin America. And I want to ask you a question here, which is, there's this notion out there, or this argument, that the reason why the global South is not uniting more with the West, sort of standing with the Western position on this Ukraine war, that betrays the success of Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda, that they can sort of sell their narrative on this war to sort of parts of the world that are not sort of standing firmly behind Ukraine. But isn't this also a problem of us not having a convincing narrative? I mean, how do you sort of see this problem set? That the global South is sort of, for a large part, balancing, trying to stay on the sidelines, that whole issue. And then Professor Hecker, on the question of how can we rebuild the global nuclear order at all, I just want to ask you, where do you perhaps see some room for convergence, a cooperation, finding a sort of common denominator, especially in light of the upcoming NPT review conference in New York? Do you think it is perhaps the Iran nuclear dossier, though it has not been possible to return to the JCPOA for perhaps reasons that are not just to do with the United States and Russia, but also the Iranians? Is it perhaps the DPRK issue, even though there at the Security Council, there was not much consensus between the United States, Russia, or China recently? I mean, what's the issue where we can perhaps start and find some convergence to try to build upon that? I'd be grateful if the panelists can take these questions, but also share anything else that you wish, and then we will go to the fellows. Rose?
Oh, thank you very much, Hannah. And since you brought up Gabuyev again, I'll put his Twitter thread in the post. And I've been saying for some time, sadly, because I agree very much with Sig Hecker that Russia has really been a giant of the non-proliferation regime. They were right at the heart of the negotiation of the non-proliferation treaty and very creative at coming up with some of the basic concepts and structures, including the formation of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Thanks to Roland Timmerbayev, who has a long association, he's passed on now, but a long association and very successful one with Monterey CNS. So I want to give a shout out to Roland and his role in negotiating the IAEA. But that kind of creative diplomacy shows really what the Russians are very capable of. And I've seen it myself in the negotiation of the New START Treaty and the START Treaty before it. So they really have been enormous contributors in a positive way to controlling and limiting nuclear weapons, and also preventing nuclear proliferation out of peaceful uses and the nuclear energy arena. So that's a basic point. But to your question to me, Hannah, and referring to Gabuyev's piece, this comes down, and I'll be very interested in what the fellows have to say about this. This comes down to the role of the younger generation in Russia, of course, and David Holloway might have something to say about this. There's a long-running strain, the Slavophiles versus the Westernizers in historical parlance in the Russian imperial time and also in more recent times as well. So that historical breakdown has been there and was very much, of course, nurtured by the role that Peter the Great played several hundred years ago. So that's there. But my question now is, what role will the younger generation play? They are showing enormous differences with the older generation. In my view, that SIAM survey that was leaked last week and appeared on Medusa shows that the younger generation, 18 to 35 years old, the numbers differ, but still a majority against the war, and strong, very strong views. How long is that going to stick as they enter adulthood and as they become more dependent on the Russian regime, on the regime as it exists today, for their professional success and also the success of their children? One of the things that has struck me, I always thought, and this was my naivete back being director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, I always thought that the inducements of Western culture, the internet, for example, and the fact that people now have mortgages and they're able to buy their apartments and own a car and build a dacha and have a successful enough professional career that they can afford to send their children abroad to school and also have foreign vacations. I thought that all of these inducements would create this class of middle class Russians ready to support and defend more democratic principles as the basis for that continuing prosperity, but it has instead been used to entrap them. And that's precisely, in my view, what Putin has been doing in this phase, essentially saying, hey, you want to hold on to your apartment, continue to be able to send your kids to a good school, continue to make your car payments, you have to come along with my war and at least acquiesce in silence. So I think that that is the situation we are facing now, and it shows it's 180 degrees different from the effect that I was expecting 15 years ago when I was at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I think many of us expected. I've seen a number of mea culpas. Hanna, I was just reading today the very, very interesting, you've probably already seen it, interview or it's his article, Michael Roth, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Bundestag, writing about the new Ostpolitik and how Germany needs to think about it. But he too reflected on that naivete I guess we all had 15, 20 years ago. So thank you, and look forward to further comments on this set of issues. What's going to be the role of today's younger generation in 30 years' time?
Thank you, Rose. Sam.
So so just to refresh everyone with what I was asked, basically Hannah laid out a scenario whereby this conflict drags on. Essentially, the economic pressure on Europe particularly gets to the point where the willingness to continue to support Ukraine fades, and essentially Russia gets to victory that way. Now, of course, defining victory is a challenge in this context, because as David noted, it's not really clear what the objectives are. Even if we're now talking about, even if it were, liberating the Donbass, then why are the plans for an annexation of Kherson and Zaporizhia? There are a lot of elements here that that seem to be sort of improvised or confused. But all that having been said, what I said was unlikely was a complete victory or collapse of one of the other side. And I think that while it is possible that the scenario that you describe unfolds, in other words, let's just say Russia takes the Donbass, Ukraine keeps fighting, but doesn't have significant success in its counteroffensive, which is not, entirely implausible by any means. And then as a result of all this economic pressure, Europe essentially folds, to put it simplistically. And because of Ukraine's dependence, ends up pushing the Ukrainians into taking a deal that they might otherwise not have taken. So the challenge is for Russia in that scenario that there really isn't going to be any sort of way in which one can imagine the Ukrainians sort of swallowing that without putting up a fight. So they might get like a Minsk-like situation where they get something on paper that looks like a political victory because the Ukrainians have no choice but to sign it, but it's never implemented and the Ukrainians resist it the entire time. I mean, the idea that an imposed peace would end Ukrainian resistance, even if at a low level, it seems unlikely to me. So I think that Russia's challenge in this context is that it cannot impose a stability on this situation merely by, attempting to impose its vision of an end state. What I think the Kremlin sort of hasn't switched from the initial concept of a brute force regime change operation where you don't need to negotiate or even persuade the adversary get or obtain his compliance with a coercive operation. Frankly, they've done a whole lot more of this coercive diplomacy using the military force over the last 8 years than they have brute force, but they seem to have trouble returning to it. And in that context, you need to be aware of the political constraints in which your adversary is operating in, and accept that ultimately you're using force in order to persuade, as opposed to merely imposing outcomes as if you don't care whether the adversary complies or not, because they're not going to get a stable outcome without a degree of Ukrainian compliance. And the idea that an imposed peace of the kind that you're describing gets you to the Ukrainians stopping the fighting, even if it's low level, even if it's not having a sort of operational impact, seems to me highly implausible. But maybe I'm overly optimistic.
Thank you for that, Sam. David.
Yes, you asked me about the global south, but actually I'd like to say, I will come to that. But the thing that I think I see is something that I had not really anticipated before the war, that bad ties with the West are not a bad thing for this leadership in Russia, because establishing relations with the West that satisfy Russia has been extremely difficult from their point of view. It's been difficult from the Western point of view, but it's mutually difficult. And in some ways, the sanctions can be framed as, well, we told you so. You know, they're against us. They don't want to do joint scientific research with us. And moreover, the world is tilting away from the West to the East, to China, and we're a Eurasian power. That's where we really now belong. We're shifting in this way. This does relate to the question about Russian culture, since my entry into this field was a degree in languages and literature. It's extremely difficult for me to think about Russian culture, as not being part of European culture, or European culture not being a very significant element in Russian culture, especially in literature. And one of the things, to come to a point that Rose made about the younger generation, is the language that Putin has used about those who've been leaving Russia. You know, so a lot of younger people, especially the more educated, and especially in the sciences and technology, who can find jobs abroad, saying, well, you know, we don't need you. You go away. You're not loyal to Russia. And so I think there's a rather profound shift taking place in Russia itself, or at least an attempt at a profound shift, which is, I think, very disturbing. On the issue of narratives in the global south, well, if we take, first of all, I agree with Sig. I think a more careful Russian policy might have said, if we're going to be very close to China, let's have good relations with the West too, not put all of our eggs in one basket. And I think that China's shown itself not to be entirely happy with what Russia has done, in a sense, in interfering with Chinese influence in Europe, or Chinese presence in Europe. Secondly, India has always adopted a rather independent policy. So, you know, buying or importing Russian oil at good prices is a perfectly logical thing for India to do, and in line with you know, at least a tradition of a non-aligned policy. And I think the global south, I'm not sure it's a question of narratives to do with this particular war. I think it's longer term narratives about, you know, what the West did, the war in Iraq, or treatment of Iran. Of course, they're very different perspectives. The global south is a very broad category. But I think the assumption, it was a mistaken assumption that people everywhere would be shocked in the same way by Russian invasion of Ukraine as people in Europe or people in the US, given the state of US-Russia relations. I'm not quite answering your question, but I am trying to point to what I see as behind this move, an attempt to make a very important shift in Russia's position in the world, and in a way in Russian culture, by appealing, or even I would say weaponizing, certain kinds of traditions of Russian nationalism and Russian exceptionalism.
Thank you for that, Siegfried Hecker.
Thank you, Hannah. Let me first chime in on David's comment, the question you asked about the global south. the way you put it is could it be that the Russian propaganda, about the war in Ukraine is so successful, it's sort of bringing along the global South? My view of that would be no. It's much more along what David Holloway just said. So the best way I can put it is we're paying for our past sins. And so that global South has been watching the United States. And in many places, the US has just done things that are considered, against what's best for the world, whether it's the war in Iraq, issues of Afghanistan, and also what's happened in Latin America, for example, over the years. And then, what really hurts is when you even bring that in today, into the present tense. You have people like John Bolton in the news over the last week, bragging about the fact how he helped to try to engineer regime change. So you look at many of those regimes in the global South, and then you have Bolton saying that, and they say we always knew it. And so, and then of course, many of the things that were done during the last administration. So I think that's what we're paying for. Your specific question to me, like what could be done? Could we do something through Iran or through North Korea? For the time being, that's all going in the wrong direction. It's just going in the wrong direction. The JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, I think what's happened there has aligned Iran more with Russia, and it has made the US certainly even more suspicious of Russia and Iran. And so I don't see that there's anything there in the JCPOA that might actually help to get us there. In North Korea, the situation has been really troublesome. And that is, for whatever reason, Kim Jong-un has actually decided that he would align himself and North Korea much more closely with Russia and then also with China. And so that undermines, a case that I've been trying to make, that for the last 30 years, North Korea in the end really did want to come to some sort of accommodation with the United States. It's not clear anymore. And so I don't see that. Are there other places? Well, I think, Rose said arms control is still important, and it certainly is. So even if the Russians still under Putin, if they'd seriously try to get back and say, okay, let's get back, whatever happens in Ukraine, the Reagan-Gorbachev dictum, we'll have to take that. I mean, that's just something that you can't go against. So perhaps some limited things, but beyond that, I don't see much. The hope also to end this, wind it up quickly, is really in what Rose said. It's the next generation. Actually, I would actually say two. The next generation, that is the younger people, and then the nuclear community itself. As you know, and many of my colleagues know, I've worked so closely with the Russian nuclear community. I've been there 57 times since 1992. We wrote the book Doomed to Cooperate because we together felt we were doomed to cooperate. Otherwise, the nuclear world is going to go to hell. They still believe that, but they're sort of restrained from the top. So when that happened, and that was post-2014, I turned to the younger generation. And so I had this young professional nuclear forum with Russian young professionals, American young professionals. We got together 7 times in the last 6 years or so. And the young Russian nuclear professionals very much think like our young nuclear professionals. They know we need to work together. We've had to sort of put that whole program into abeyance because at this point, politically, it doesn't work. So I think what we need to figure out is how can we get their voices back? And that's what hope has to be. Thank you.